right, so we should be back online. Alright, so we should be back online and hopefully ready to go. So, let's start this back up, and so where were we with Final Fantasy IV? Oh, I was talking about the graphical. No, was I still talking about the re-releases, or was I on the graphical style yet? Before it crashed. Crap, now I don't remember. Well, then let's just move on to the graphical style. That 3DS graphical style that I just like so much. I think it's even worse in Final Fantasy IV than it is in Final Fantasy III. Because Final Fantasy III, they had to update anyway. They didn't have to update Final Fantasy IV. They had newer, more updated versions that had higher poly count and higher color fidelity already. They didn't need to do that that 3D version. And it looked like crap. The voice acting for this version was also... well, that's not true. I was going to say it was terrible. It just wasn't good. It just wasn't good. It could have been worse. We could have had Final Fantasy X all over again. Thank God we didn't. But we'll get to that, don't worry. But it wasn't great. I'm going to blame the voice director because that seems to be the problem with Final Fantasy X as well. Was the voice director either was inexperienced or had never worked with these casts before. I don't know what to say other than it was bad. But the worst thing about Final Fantasy IV is that despite the fact that so many characters make sacrifices for your team, the twins, Sid, crap, what's his name? Feng? Yeah, Feng. Despite all of their sacrifices, it doesn't matter. They all make it out alive and unhurt. Their sacrifices mean nothing. They carry no weight. Now, you don't know that at the time. And everyone's, oh, happy ending. Yay. But no. That's not how that works. We don't have any emotional weight at the end of the game when everyone comes back to greet Cecil and what's her name as King and Queen. It's just bad storytelling. Now, some of the good things about Final Fantasy IV. It had voice acting at all in this version. That's great. The fact that they, as far as improving this SNES game, they went back and had voice acting for it. It wasn't good voice acting, but they had it. So that's something. That's an improvement. The 5 character slots as opposed to 4 is kind of a mixed blessing. The most normal enemies throughout the game are easy because you have an additional character. The bosses, they scaled up difficulty enough that everything turned out to be okay, but still, The base game overall was easier. The bosses were harder, so that's a good thing. The storyline is very classic, with enough added to it to not make it stale. Like Final Fantasy III's was kind of stale. But Final Fantasy IV's had a lot of good, solid fantasy tropes, but it had enough of a twist on those tropes that it wasn't a bad thing. So kudos, Final Fantasy IV. Also, the story was rather in-depth. There was a lot of world building that happened in Final Fantasy IV. I think it could have used a little bit more, personally, but no, it was good. It was a good job, guys. Good job, Square. Although, I don't know why that game gets so many re-releases when 1, 2, and 3 have only had a couple. So I don't understand that aspect of it, but whatever. If they're going to keep releasing it and people are going to keep buying it, then they're going to keep releasing it even more. Now, on to Final Fantasy V. The worst things about Final Fantasy V are actually very small. There's very few things in Final Fantasy V that are terrible. One of the worst things is that the tutorial that they have, what little tutorial that they have, is really bad. It's pretty atrocious as far as tutorials go. And unfortunately, that's a pretty common theme in the Final Fantasy franchise. Tutorials are just very lackluster. They don't really have anyone that knows what they're doing when it comes to tutorials. Equipment weight mattering. That is something that has never mattered before in a Final Fantasy game, but it does in 5. You have to watch your character's equipment weight. You can't get it too high because that affects their initiative order. Which in and of itself isn't a bad thing to have in a game. I just think it's bad to have in a Final Fantasy game. It's something that we've never had to worry about before, and then suddenly we do. So, like, I don't know. I don't know if it's... I just don't think it's something that they should have introduced into Final Fantasy. But we're still going on kind of those D&D roots, and equipment matters in D&D. And I'm assuming that they were taking that from D&D and kind of trying to seeing how it would work in a Final Fantasy, and it just really didn't. So, now we're on to the good things, the pros of Final Fantasy V. First off, first usage of cutscenes. Not extensive, and not overly complex cutscenes, but first cutscenes. So that's something. And considering what cutscenes have become to mean to Final Fantasy games, that's actually quite a bit. Those cutscenes were mostly done using Mode 7, which was kind of a pseudo 3D graphical style that used only 16-bit 2D graphics, but it presented them in such a way that you had 5 layers. No, it was 7 layers, Mode 7. It had 7 layers, and each layer was its own thing that you would have the game being processed simultaneously, which is kind of neat. The storyline was extraordinarily complex in Final Fantasy V, with the multiple worlds and the two, like, the villain and the heroes coming from this other world, except not all of them. The transgender aspect, Faris, just a lot going on, but they managed to have it work. It all comes together and it all just works really well. Other things that started in this game. Blue mages. For the first time, we get blue mages, or enemy skill, or whatever the hell Quina calls it. But you know what I'm getting at. Where an enemy uses an ability on you, or you eat the enemy, or however they happen to model it for that particular game, and then you get to use you get to learn a specific ability that monster had, and you can use it whenever you want. Which brings me to the expanded / refined job system. Final Fantasy V is probably the best job system out of any Final Fantasy game. How it works in Final Fantasy V is you start a job, you are that job. When you get to a certain level, based on what job it is, you have mastered that job and all the skills that job has associated with it, you can then take and use in any of your free skill slots. So if you really want to dual wield as a samurai, well, hope you had, I think, fighter, and then you can wield two katanas as a samurai character. Also, that leads me into the fact that the classes were semi-customizable. You could change up how you wanted your characters to be. Not exactly on the fly, but in between fights at least, so that's huge. If something's not working out for you, or you know there's a particular fight coming up where you need a specific combination of skills, you can make it happen. And that was really nice. It really made it feel like the choices that you had decided on from class to class mattered. Also, even though there's not many, there are characters that sacrifice themselves for you in the storyline. And they stay dead. And it matters that they stay dead. It's important that those characters actually sacrifice something, and your characters had to take advantage of that character willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. It brought weight to what those characters had to do. It was incredibly important to the world of Final Fantasy that you give consequences. Obviously, the most notable being Grandpa, the old man, the old pervert, who sacrifices himself, and then his granddaughter takes over. That's an important part of that game. And if they had made it so that he or the wolf man, I can't remember all the characters' names off the top of my head, had not killed themselves, or not killed themselves, had not done something, had not sacrificed for the greater good, our characters will not have been able to survive to get powerful enough to defeat Exdeath. So that is how you do character sacrifice well. And the fact that they did it well, and that it actually meant something, and that it was important. It's a good thing. But Final Fantasy V was not well received enough in Japan for them to believe that it would be well received in America. And it wasn't until years later that it got an American release, and did okay. And then it came out on Steam. It has done exceptionally well, actually. It has sold many, many copies since its digital release on Steam. So we the game has done well for itself, and I highly recommend you picking it up if you haven't at least played it for yourselves. It's good. It's very good. So, on to Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy VI is widely considered the best Final Fantasy ever made, critically speaking, and by most greater Final Fantasy fans. But it has some flaws, especially this newer version. Flaw number 1, the updated character portraits. So they updated the character portraits, made them more vibrant and more colorful, as opposed to the subdued watercolors that we originally had. And that is the classic art style of... Crap, I can't remember his name. But he does a lot of the character concept art for Square. And he does it all in watercolors and pencil. And it's beautiful and classy. And updating the character portraits just... It took something away from that. Also... just like previous games, the tutorial and future games, the tutorial's not good in Final Fantasy VI. It needs a lot of work. Oh god, and Sabin's combos. I personally had some problems with Sabin's combos. They tried something unique with Sabin. The combo inputs are not recognized well enough for them to be pulled off consistently. You can get them off, and you can usually get them off on the second try, maybe the third. But if you're not very careful with your button inputs and making sure that they get recognized, you're going to fail them. And considering that that essentially makes him do nothing for a turn, that sucks. It makes you feel bad, and it just sucks. It's not a fun aspect. That being said, the fact that they tried it at all is great. Now for some of the reasons why people love, including myself, Final Fantasy VI. At the time, and actually for the most part even today, it is the most complex storyline in a Final Fantasy game. And it's done very well. The complexity does not hinder the rest of the game. The villain, Kefka, is amazing. I mean, he's the Joker. Let's not mince words here. He's the Joker, but so good. He's such a good villain. And he wins. The villain succeeds in his plan to destroy the world, kind of. But it's just so good. The characters have complex motivations. I mean, it sucks that every single one of them has a tragic backstory. But the stories are good and well designed, well written. And they make sense as to why these characters are on this quest to do this thing. There's not many, just like in Final Fantasy V. But there are a couple character deaths. And they matter. Most notably, at least for our playthrough, Shadow. We did not rescue Shadow properly, and therefore he died. So we failed in that regard, and because we failed, he died, and he died for good. It's not that we failed to save him correctly, so then he shows up and won't be our friend anymore. No. We failed to save him correctly, and he's dead forever. I fucked up on that one. That's my fault. We never rescued Gogo, the mime. So he's also dead. Again, my fault. I don't know this for a fact. This next pro, some people might think is a con, and that is that this game has what might be the first QTE segments. If you don't know what QTE stands for, it's called QuickTime Event. It was most notably made popular in Resident Evil 4, where there's a whole big knife fight sequence between two characters, and you have to push buttons at certain times in order to make certain effects happen, otherwise you lose. This might be the first game to have them. So that's something. I don't know necessarily that's a pro or a con, but it's something. First ever multi-party dungeon, which gets used a lot more frequently in later games, so the fact that it's here is just fabulous. Also, there's no real main character in this game. There's a couple, I would say there's a couple of main characters. The first one that we are kind of shown as our main character is Terra. And the reason why I'd say she's not necessarily the main character is because she does take a back seat a lot of the times while she's having an existential crisis. But she's kind of a main character. But then later, Celeste kind of becomes the main character as we take control of her to search out everybody else and rebuild the party. So there's a lot in Final Fantasy VI that is above and beyond what you would expect from a game at the time, which, because there's so much of it that is above and beyond, that pretty much means that it's got to be the best Final Fantasy game there is, right? I mean, there's just so much about this game that succeeds where other games or game companies would have failed horribly trying to accomplish something so robust and over the top. But it's good. It's so good. So well done. And for the most part, I have nothing but praise to heap upon this game. And it deserves it. It really does. I mean, the more I think about it, the better off this game is in my mind. Still doesn't change my... Oh, by the way, I'm not going to show you the exact placements, but I have here a compiled list. Am I covering it up sufficiently? I think so. Of where critics placed games and where I place the Final Fantasy games. And it's not just critics. I spent pretty much all weekend scouring the internet for Final Fantasy rankings to see where people put the Final Fantasy games when ranked against each other. And then I did that after I did my ranking. So once we get to the end, I'll give you guys my ranking of the games in order, and then the critics' ranking of the games in order, and we'll see, where we differ and where we're the same. Final Fantasy VII. The darling of the franchise, primarily because it is the game that most people started with. And I have a theory, and it has been mostly true, and that is that the game that brought you into Final Fantasy is usually the one that people enjoy the most. Now, this is not flawless. It is just a trend that I have noticed throughout the years. So, I didn't talk about the first RPG revolution, but Final Fantasy IV started an RPG revolution during the Super Nintendo era that brought more and more people into JRPGs and brought more JRPGs to America. So, there's a lot about that game that was really, really important. Forgot about that. Our accidental beating of Sephiroth. But Final Fantasy VII sparked a resurgence in JRPGs. If you look at the number of JRPGs that were released on any particular console, what you will find is that probably 50% of all JRPGs released in America were released on the Sony PlayStation because of Final Fantasy VII. And why was Final Fantasy VII considered so high at the time? Well, first off, it's the first video game commercial I ever remember seeing in, like, wide distribution. It's the first game in the franchise to have 3D graphics. I mean, as you can see here, they're not spectacular 3D graphics, but still, they are 3D graphics. The materia system was hugely customizable. You could turn your characters into pretty much whatever you wanted. Now, they had level up, predetermined level ups, and they were kind of set on one of three paths, either a mostly balanced path, a mostly magical path, or a mostly physical path, and just because you could swap around materia and you could really customize a character. Also, this was, I believe, the first game where if you spent the time to do so, you could literally make your characters perfect by getting enough of the sources, the power source, endurance, speed, mind, and spirit, I believe, were all the different sources. And as long as you had those, like, as long as you farmed those out, you could make your characters perfect. So this is pretty much the first game where you could trade patience for a perfect game file. Also, really, it's the introduction of the limit breaks, or bursts, or whatever you want to call them. Really did a lot. I mean, just think about how flashy the limit breaks are. They're really something. And considering they became, for the most part, a mainstay of the Final Fantasy series, that's really saying something. Something so late in the franchise becoming a constant. Unfortunately, Final Fantasy VII is not quite the shining gem that everyone believes it to be. At least I don't think so. I think there's a lot in the game that is flawed and needs to be addressed. First off, actually, it's pretty much all having to do with the story. Our villains' motivations are extremely one-dimensional and crappy. What does Shinra want? Shinra wants to kill everyone who's not making him money. Not... like, he doesn't care about the common people. They're not making him money, so he wants them to die. He tries to drop a section of the city onto the common people because they're causing him some relatively minor troubles. In fact, he does, and kills a lot of people for seemingly no reason. Sephiroth. Sephiroth wants everyone in the world to die so that he and the rest of the ancients, or people with ancient blood, can ascend to godhood. When his entire life up to that point, he was a good person who wanted to help people out. I mean, he did his job. He was a soldier in the organization Soldier. But he had shown no signs of anything of breaking like this before. And then suddenly, I mean, like, people have breakdowns. Don't get me wrong. People have breakdowns and they can sometimes be extraordinarily dramatic. But he goes from wanting to do his best to help people to wanting to murder everyone in the world and become a god. Now, I'm not going to say that that's completely impossible for someone to have happen to their psyche, depending on certain revelations, but it seems kind of forced and not terribly good motivation, to be honest. Also, there's a lot of good storylines that are started in this game that mostly fall by the wayside. The whole eco-terrorist thing with Avalanche and Shinra, yeah, that's a great storyline. It starts off really strong. You have all these people involved in this secret organization that's trying to take down this big, evil corporate government. And then we leave the city and that all just gets thrown out the door. The moment we leave Midgar, you can kick that entire storyline out the window. The love story between Aerith and Cloud that we're supposed to believe is there is crap. Utter crap. Aerith is definitely infatuated with Cloud, but we are never shown anything about Cloud that makes us believe that he gives two shits about Aerith. Yeah, he tries to help her in the beginning. You know what? Cloud's a good guy. That doesn't mean he's madly in love with her. Yeah, he puts her to rest when she gets stabbed by Sephiroth. Sorry, spoilers. Doesn't mean anything. Also, all you people out there that think they should have just used a Phoenix Down on her, that's not how Phoenix Downs work. People aren't dead at 0 hit points. They're unconscious. Phoenix Downs bring them back from unconsciousness. Sorry, had to get that out there. That has always been a pet peeve of mine when people try to throw that logic out there. But no, Final Fantasy VII, hey Taco, just has a lot that is not great. Like, I know it's beloved. I know everyone loves Final Fantasy VII. It's just a mediocre game with good customization for your characters. That's what Final Fantasy VII is. I'm sorry. I know a lot of you probably love that game. It's not that good. That's my 2 cents on it anyway. Oh boy. Final Fantasy VIII. I went into Final Fantasy VIII hating it. Hating it with a passion. I had hated Final Fantasy VIII since it came out on the PlayStation. A decade and a half ago. Yeah. That's how much I hate Final Fantasy VIII. Going into the game, I was not having fun. And here's the main reason why. I hate the drawing magic system. Final Fantasy IV is good. It's got some problems, primarily on the technical side, but it's good. But Final Fantasy VIII, man, the draw junction system. And it's not even the junctioning the magic system that I hate, or the drawing magic that I hate in and of themselves. It's the fact that when I draw magic, if I decide that I need to equip my party with fire, because fire does very good on damage boosting, well, now I need to spend half an hour fighting a singular enemy in order to make it so that my team has enough fire. Well, you picked a good one. That way my team has enough of the fire spell to actually be able to junction it to them. And then, oh, but that's not all. Then, once I have all those fire spells to junction to my party's stats, that way they can become slightly stronger, now I can't use those fire spells. Because the moment I use a fire spell, I've now made them weaker. That whoever the person I had use that fire spell. That is why I hate that system. If you never actually use magic, then whatever, it's fine, it doesn't matter. You just spent a whole bunch of time grinding on singular enemies to get all the spells that you need to make your character slightly stronger. That's fine. I also really dislike how the characters are one-dimensional middle school stereotypes. All their personalities, I equate to that of a middle schooler. They're all terrible. Sylphie just wants everyone to be happy, and Squall is dour and aloof and hates everybody and everything and doesn't care. And Irvin's that cool guy. Everybody loves him. He's the life of the party. And Zell is just hyper and always ready to go. It's just annoying. Remember, role-playing games are supposed to be the more mature style of games. I know that games for the longest time are for the realm of children, but I don't feel that Final Fantasy VIII, despite it being about child soldiers and internal struggles and time war, I don't have the feeling that any of these characters or anyone who played this game gives a shit. Yeah, and Squall had the most development in that he kind of likes someone and is willing to kind of bend a little bit on his dour sourpuss attitude for Rinoa. This game was also critically reviled. It was torn apart by critics. They did not like it. Most fans don't like this game. There's a few that die-hard fans that love this game to death. And you know what? So far, everything that I've said is just one guy's opinion. That's fine. If you love this game, play it, please. Love it, enjoy it. It is yours to enjoy. It exists for all time in perpetuity as it is. So if you love it, please, love it. Enjoy it. Fight to try and convince people that it is a better game than it appears to be. You don't need to argue. Just show them the good parts. Just show them the parts about this game that are good and hope that they can overlook the things that aren't very good. I unfortunately cannot look past those things that I think are terrible. Now, some of the good things about Final Fantasy VIII. The character designs are incredibly memorable. You will never confuse a Final Fantasy VIII character design for any other Final Fantasy game. The characters look... I mean, I think Squall's half jacket is kind of dumb, but the characters look fabulous. Their character designs are unique and very interesting. The music is really outstanding in Final Fantasy VIII, with Eyes on Me being probably one of the most standout songs in Final Fantasy history. Also, I know I harped really badly on the drawing, magic, and junctioning system, but they have made it extremely user-friendly in terms of being able to take an entire junction setup from one character and slap it on someone else, which is incredibly handy. And very, very awesome that they made that user-friendliness. Now, there's one thing that I haven't talked about with Final Fantasy VIII, and that is something that I personally hate, but most people love about the game, and that is the card game. I personally cannot stand the card game in Final Fantasy VIII for a couple of reasons. One, it is partially necessary that you play it. Assuming you want the best weapons in the game, you have to play the card game, and you have to play it well. And win all the time. Otherwise, you're gonna suffer for it. A lot of people love the card game. I personally do not. Part of the reason I don't like it is because of the seeming necessity of playing it. Also, the fact that you have to change the rule. Every region you go to around the world has different rules. And you can take those rules and move them from location to location, but I hate the fact that that's even a thing that can happen. But a lot of people love it. In fact, a lot of people love it so much that they believe that that is the only reason to be playing this game. Okay, there's definitely something going on with my computer. I might need to reformat, because I'm looking here at my CPU usage is up to 50%. So we might see another crash. I'm really sorry if we do. I might have to reformat over the weekend. That'd be unfortunate, but, you know, you do what you have to. Alright, so let's move on to Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy IX came at the very end of the PlayStation. But Square is really good at squeezing out every last little bit of processing power out of the games that they make at the end of the cycle. That's why Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger are so amazing, because they came at the very end of the life cycle of the Super Nintendo, and Square had all that experience and whatnot building Super Nintendo games, so they were able to make those games even better. Similarly, with Final Fantasy IX, it is awesome. Now, replaying it took some of that rose tint off of my glasses, but I still love it. It is... spoilers for later, when we get to the breakdown of where I rank these games. Final Fantasy IX is my #1 spot. I love that game a lot. But it has some problems. #1, the music in Final Fantasy IX, although well done, is not particularly memorable. It just kind of is what it is. Although, a lot of people hate the Chocobo music, which is what we're listening to right now. I personally love the Chocobo music from Final Fantasy IX. I love that kind of, like, pseudo mariachi guitar, like, plucking thing that's going on. I dig it. Near about the last quarter of the game, an event occurs in Final Fantasy IX that, going back and replaying it, like, I was not a big fan of it. This is one of the reasons why people don't like it. We go to another world. That's fine. We've been to secondary worlds throughout Final Fantasy's history. About half of the games take place on 2 worlds. But the second world in Final Fantasy IX was really kind of a letdown. The only really good thing that happened in it was the cutscene where Kuja destroys it. But the worst problem there is that Zidane, our main character, who's kind of fun-loving and nothing really gets him down, he goes through a massive identity crisis. To the point where he's seemingly given up on life? Now, having a small identity crisis and being like, oh man, oh boy, I really don't know what's going on here, I don't know what to do with myself anymore, but no. He mopes, and he whines, and he tries to alienate everybody from him. And I personally don't buy it, and I think it's... I know what they're trying to say, that he no longer feels like he has a purpose in life, but I don't think they did it very well. And it wouldn't have taken much, either, to make it just that much better. And that would have changed everything. Another thing that I don't like is we have a few too many comic relief characters in Final Fantasy IX. So we have Steiner, who's kind of a bumbling knight. Very honorable, and well-meaning, but bumbling comic relief. We have Quina, who is bumbling comic relief. And then we have Aiko, who is pseudo-romantic, bumbling comic relief. That seems like a lot. 3 out of 8 characters? That's not good. They could have done so much more. But they didn't. And the game suffers for it. Now, that being said, that's pretty much all that's wrong with that game. The world, it has a very rich, well-developed history that we get to see. The first 3 quarters of the storyline are amazing. All the characters are lovable. Every single character is lovable. Except for maybe Amarant, unless you like are really into kind of whiny monk type characters, which some people are, so whatever. I'm not going to judge you on that. I was way into Amarant as one of my favorite characters for a long time. But the most important upside to Final Fantasy IX, it has Vivi. And Vivi is possibly the greatest character in Final Fantasy history. Vivi for life. Also, all the cutscenes in Final Fantasy IX look way better than cutscenes from future games. So that's something that's a little odd, but that I am totally down for. Because Final Fantasy IX's cutscenes are amazing. Most especially any of the cutscenes where there's massive destruction. The two with Bahamut, the one with Bahamut and then the one with Bahamut and Alexander. Those are so good. And then the cutscene where Kuja destroys his homeworld with what I can only assume are Ultima spells of a variety. Oh, so good. Just so freaking good. Out of this world beautiful. And the love story between Zidane and Garnet is really touching and well written. It's rather amazing, actually, that Square, despite everything that we'd seen in the past, was able to make that love story believable and like actually have feeling to it. Now, we're a little ahead because of the games in terms of what we're viewing because, well, some of these games have really, really long final sequences. Especially once we get to Final Fantasy IX's, that final sequence is an hour long. But we're doing this all at 1.9 times speed, so it's going through these pretty quickly. So, Final Fantasy X. There's a lot about Final Fantasy X that is not good. But it is one of the more beloved Final Fantasy games. And I have a hard time wrapping my head around those two concepts. I don't know if it's because it's the first one that we naturally get to experience with voice acting. Is it all Auron? Do people just love Auron so much that they're willing to overlook the rest of that game? I mean, the love story that's in there is okay. It's actually pretty good. But the game is just got so many flaws. And I'm not talking graphically. I remember when that game came out, that game blew me away at how good it looked. I mean, I guess we just have to get into the flaws. The game, first off, despite how amazing that game looks, it is way too overly reliant on pre-rendered cutscenes. Now, I know what franchise we're talking about. We're talking about Final Fantasy. The company that made pre-rendered cutscenes a staple in gaming. But Final Fantasy X, man, that's a whole nother level. And I don't... So we've got a local shop in town that you can rent like anime and other stuff from. And they do a lot of Chinese bootlegs of things. Because you're going to get those a lot faster. Chinese bootlegs with kind of fan subs hard subbed on to the disc. And I remember there was a disc that they had for a long time that was all the cutscenes from Final Fantasy X. Nothing else, just the cutscenes. It was something like a 3 DVD set. I mean, they weren't high quality DVDs because you could fit the entire game on one, so that should tell you something about the quality of the DVDs that China pirates were using. But still, it was like 4.5 hours of cutscene in that game. Of pre-rendered cutscene. That's freaking ridiculous. Like, come on, guys. I get it. You love pre-rendered cutscenes. But Jesus. Another thing, the voice acting in that game, with a couple of exceptions, was absolutely terrible. Now, because they had some professional voice actors on there, and even they did not deliver as well as they normally do, I'm going to lay most of that on the feet of A, the script, which is maybe the worst script in Final Fantasy, and B, the voice acting director. The voice director, it had to have been one of their first jobs. I don't know what. It's just terrible. Most notably, the laughing scene. And if you've played Final Fantasy X or watched my playthrough of it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That scene is bad. Like, pretend it doesn't exist bad. So what else was bad in it? I've already talked about the script. That script was, with the exception of the scenes where it's just Tidus and Yuna, except for those few scenes where it's just Tidus and Yuna, or just Auron and Tidus, that script is miserable. It deserves to be chucked into the ocean, along with Fujin here. Or not, sorry, Fujin doesn't get tossed. Oh yeah, he does. Yeah. He deserves to get tossed into the sea just like Fujin there. The leveling, that sphere grid, was overly complex, considering until you complete each character's section, it's just linear. You're just moving from ability to ability until you get to the point where you have enough locks to actually split into other people's areas. And even then, there's a linear progression that they want you to take. There's an obvious progression where certain peoples move into certain others so that they kind of stay similar to their class. That leads me to the next thing about linearity. The environmental design of Final Fantasy X is linear. Now, we've already talked about why it's not as bad in its linearity as Final Fantasy XIII, and that is the fact that you can go back. So even though it is linear, they're pushing you forward in a single direction with everything being hallways. The hallways are A, more varied in their appearance and motion, in terms of like how many bends they have and whatnot. But for the most part, the game is still a hallway. The big difference is, at any point you can move back. You can stop your forward movement, even though that's what they're pushing you towards, and you can take a step back and go into a previous area and mess around with there for a little while. Also, no world map? No overworld map. Come on, guys. That actually started a trend for a couple of games that was... Actually, no. It and only one other game are the only ones to not have explorable maps and push you forward in a singular direction. Blitzball is the next flaw, in my opinion. Blitzball is a minigame that includes leagues and recruitment and micromanaging of levels and abilities, and is pretty much just a waste of your time unless you are trying to get all the best stuff for Wakka. It's a waste of your time. It's terrible. Well, it's not terrible. It's just... It has hidden math. They tell you all this stuff up front, but there is stuff about the game that they don't tell you that is hidden behind subsystems. And because of that, it suffers. And what should be a fun minigame becomes kind of tedious. Also, why can't we use the actual whole sphere? This game is in 3D, right? No, actually. It's on different varying degrees of 3D looking environment that is actually only 3D models on a 2D planes. Elevation never matters in that game. Everything is on a 2D plane. So, what's good about the game? I've just spent the last, 10 minutes railing on it about how it's a piece of crap. But it's got some good stuff, too. Number one, the character designs are iconic. You'll have a hard time finding more beloved character designs than Yuna, Tidus, Auron, Wakka, Riku, Lulu, and Kimahri. Their actual character designs are fabulous. Also, the world building. The Machina Wars, the creation of Sin, the whole religion, like that. They spent so much time on the world building that it really shows through and shines. The history of that world is deep, entrenched, and they have shown it off very, very well. Also, on the same vein as one of the flaws, the pre-rendered cutscenes are ridiculously beautiful. Holy crap. When Yuna, for the first time, does ascending, when we get to see her do the sending on Kilika, the scene where they are making out in the lake, absolutely wonderful cutscenes. And despite how horrible the script is, that love scene is really good. Like, or love scene, I personally feel like the relationship between Yuna and Tidus, is believable. So they figured out how to write a good love scene, because we've had Final Fantasy VIII have a good love scene, Final Fantasy IX have a good love scene, and Final Fantasy X have good love scenes. So clearly they figured out how to write a good love scene. Okay, got an hour left and 3 games to go. Hopefully we can make it. And hopefully we don't crash. Alright, so Final Fantasy XII. Now, I specifically waited to get Final Fantasy XII on PC because I have it up there on the shelf. We could have played that version on the PS2, but I'm really glad they put it out when they did for PC, because then we got to play it with the upgraded license grid system, because the original license grid system is a piece of junk where every character ends up the same. Literally the same. The only difference is a few stats from their independent leveling slash their starting. Like their actual stat bonuses from leveling. But it is... The original license grid was garbage. It was 2 large grid boards, looked kind of like the periodic table in a weird sort of way. And even though each person started on a different section, by the end of the game, everybody had every slot. The only differences were who got what summons. The other big flaw that I see is, at a certain point in the game, Penelo is still with the team. Why? You'll notice that she doesn't bring anything to the table. After we rescue her, nothing that she does helps the team out, aside from like her in-combat stuff, but nothing storyline-wise that she does actually matters. Vaughn steps up and becomes an integral part of the storyline, even though he starts as kind of just a hanger-on and nobody cares. He's kind of a joke early on. He's a kid, but then he steps up and he starts, like, proving that he's worthwhile inclusion on the team. But really, the storyline is about Lady Ashe and Balthier. That's who the main characters of this storyline are. And they get the most screen time in terms of like cutscenes. They have the most dialogue once they're introduced, once they're both on the team. Their storylines are the most complex and interesting. They're clearly the main characters of the game. At least they were supposed to be. And actually, they were supposed to be the main characters of the game until a buzzword started happening in the gaming industry, which is something that is frequently used in movies and later became more used in games. So that is the audience analog. If you're not familiar with this term, that is someone in the game or movie or TV show that doesn't know what's going on in the world. How do they not know what's going on in the world? Well, there's a lot of ways you can have them not know what's going on, but primarily in video games what they usually do is some street urchin or some farmer or someone who lives in another country or an out-of-the-way place so that they don't know what's going on in the storyline that the producers are trying to tell us. Vaughn and Penelo were added later in the game, in the game's writing and development, to offer a male and female audience analog. That way, you would have 2 characters that knew nothing about the greater storyline of the world that you could exposit to, that you could tell them what was going on in the world. That way the player, who knows nothing about the world, would know what's going on in the world. Now, this is not inherently a bad thing. It all depends on how it's done. Most games fail at this horribly, and the reason they fail so badly is because they use it as an opportunity to just dump exposition on the players. When really what you should do is you should have a few snippets here and there that help you come to the conclusions that you're supposed to about the world, as opposed to them just coming out and saying like, did you know that the Empire is trying to take over the world? I wonder if the Emperor is a bad man for trying to take over the world. What do you think? I mean, that was a very simple exposition there. But that's the kind of bullshit that they will put in games and TV shows and movies to try and explain it, because there's no way that the audience could get the nuances of the story without us telling them everything about the story that's happened up to this point. It's an annoying thing that they use, that is used in game television. It's used in story writing all the time. Here's the thing. Your players and characters don't need to know everything that's going on in the world. They just need to know what's relevant to the story you're trying to tell. As a RPG writer myself, I mean, it's only pen and papers, I frequently don't tell my players crap. I tell them what they see in the city. If they want to know, like, if someone is like going out of their way to like find some rumors, I'll come up with something. I'll improv it. I don't have anything written. But if my characters aren't specifically looking for rumors, I'm not gonna tell them. If they're not looking for rumors, then they don't care about rumors about the city or the people in it or whatever. That's a thing that a lot of game devs need to work on, or game writers need to work on, is how you tell people the information that they need to know. Now that I've gone on my little rant about exposition dumps and audience analogs, let's get back. Good things. There's a lot of very good things about Final Fantasy XII. The Gambit system is my personal favorite thing about Final Fantasy XII. The fact that you can pseudo-program your characters into doing what you want them to do with certain situations. Fabulous. Freaking amazing. All the dialogue interactions between every character, even Penelo, who is not necessarily useful, if they are not exposition dumps to Vaan and Penelo, every single dialogue interaction in that game is extremely well written and fabulously voice acted. All the areas are fairly large and open, and you can, if you, with a couple of exceptions, as long as you're strong enough, you can just walk anywhere from zone to zone with nothing really stopping you. I mean, presumably the enemies in the next zone are going to kick your ass and send you packing, but that's on you. As long as you're strong enough, even at the very beginning of the game, you can go all the way to, where can you walk? You could go all the way to Giza Plains, to Hen Mines. You could just walk wherever you feel like it. As long as you're powerful enough to fight the mobs that are in your way, you can just go. And I know I said that the license grid originally was a terrible piece of crap that deserves to be thrown into the ocean. The new license grid for the Zodiac Edition is fabulous. You have to make decisions that matter. You only get to pick 2 classes for your characters, which limits the equipment that they're going to get, the HP they're going to have, their strength, their magic. So good. That one, the new Gambit system in the Zodiac Edition is so good. They did a very good rework of that to make sure that none of the characters felt too similar. Um, Final Fantasy XII is just a very good game. It gets a lot of praise, but it deserves more than it gets. It gets a lot of praise, but it deserves so much more than that. It's a shame, really, but there's very little that one can do now at this point. If people are not familiar with Final Fantasy XII now, it might be too late. It might be too late for that game. Fortunately, since the re-releases of all these games on Steam, I mean, they're not dead and they're not going anywhere. But, God. A lot of these games deserve better. A lot of these games also deserve worse. But, we'll leave that to this next game. Final Fantasy XIII. For anyone that watched me go through Final Fantasy XIII, you'll know that by the end of Final Fantasy XIII, I was broken down. The game beat me. I kept playing it out of stubbornness to actually move forward with the Final Fantasy franchise, but I almost stopped playing Final Fantasy because of 13. This time. When I originally played Final Fantasy 13, I just quit playing that game and sold it back to GameStop or wherever I bought it from. I don't remember. But because I forced myself to get through the whole game, that game hurt me. And I don't understand why there's 2 sequels to it. The game was critically reviled. Fans overall couldn't stand that game. And yet, it got 2 sequels. Hell, the game ends on a sequel bait. We get that sequel. That game ends on a sequel bait, despite it having fewer sales than the first game. They decided that they were going to follow through on that sequel bait. And then the third game had even fewer sales. I almost lost faith in Square as a whole because of Final Fantasy 13. That game deserves far worse than I could ever heap on it. But I'm going to try. I'm going to try to throw as much hatred onto that game as it deserves. So, let's get to it. Let's see if I can manage to do my hatred of that game justice. So, first off, the game is so linear that it gates you at the end of most areas to the point where you can't go back to the previous one. Or at the beginning of most areas, so you can't go back to the previous one. So it's not just linear in the world design and how they push you forward. The hallway, as it's called. But you can't move backwards in the hallway. It's a hallway of doors. I hate itchy nose syndrome that I get while streaming. And once a door is closed behind you, It's locked, and you can't go back. There was a Penny Arcade comic done a long time ago when Final Fantasy XIII first came out about how the game doesn't start until you're 30 hours in. And how that's acceptable. That is not acceptable. And what people are referring to is the portion where it opens up and you're on Pulse. That's what people are referring to with that. Except that's not the game. The game doesn't start there. It opens up, sure, it becomes one large, massive area. But that's not where the game starts. It's not where the game really gets going. In fact, that's where the game dies. It's pushing you along at a breakneck speed, pushing you forward for as quickly as it can to get you to this spot. And then it just opens up the world for you to explore with no direction and no care in the world. You just keep doing the submissions, man. Just do the submissions until you do all the submissions, and then just explore and find all the items and all the Easter eggs. And it's terrible. And then you leave that zone. And you don't even have to get on the ship to get back. The moment you start actually pushing forward with the storyline again, once you are done doing as many of the side quests as you want to do, it just becomes a line again. You get the hallway. You just get the freaking hallway with the doors and the locks. I mean, as long as you're on Pulse, you can teleport to previous areas. And then you leave Pulse. And once you leave Pulse, it is literally the hallway again. And it's just miserable. The whole thing, beginning to end, giant pile of crap. I cannot understate how much I hate Final Fantasy XIII. But that's enough about linear game design. Now let's talk about the Crystarium. The Crystarium is a terrible leveling up system. It's kind of like the Sphere Grid, except even more linear. Because, God forbid you want to branch out into the other classes, aside from the 3 primary ones. Because if you do, even getting the most basic crap in those classes costs you an arm and a leg worth of Crystarium points. And then you're still not even getting everything. You can't say, take Lightning and turn her into a Sentinel, and then go all the way up the Sentinel tree and have all the Sentinel stuff, just like everybody else who's a Sentinel. Nope, can't do it. Because that would make goddamn sense, that all the Sentinels have all the same stuff. Even if they get it at different times. Getting it at different times, whatever, that's fine. All the Sentinels, no matter who's you put through Sentinel, should have all the same things. At least as far as abilities. Put them in different orders, whatever, that doesn't matter. What matters is you're not taking the classes and making them classes. You stripped away the classes and you put the character progression into a narrow funnel and said, yeah, you can You can climb out of that funnel a little bit. But the moment you start deviating from the funnel, you just slide right back into it. Those are the most egregious things going on with Final Fantasy 13. Oh, actually, no. There's also one other thing that's horribly egregious. The fan service. They took what is supposed to be... I mean, she's in actuality, like, 1,500 years old. But she's supposed to be like a 17-year-old girl, maybe a 15-year-old girl, and turns her into a sex symbol. And I'm not joking. Her mark for being a l'Cie is she has to lift up her skirt to her hip line in order for us to see it. And see that also, she appears to not be wearing any underwear. Thanks, game. Thanks. And it's not once or twice that they do something to make her a piece of fan service. It's like 5 times. Just variously throughout the game. Now, to talk about the good things. Because as much as I hate Final Fantasy XIII, it's not all bad. There are things initially, and my second time through, that at least kept me going for a little while until the game beat me down too much. And those two things are kind of intertwined. Number one is that the characters, each and every one of them, is extremely nuanced and has character development. And not kind of like hackney character development either. Like, they do a good job writing these characters and turning them into what feels like people. And fairly compelling characters at that. And this is number 2, with strong motivations. Each of the characters has a very strong motivation. We're not always told what that is up front, but we understand what all the motivations are and how, by the end of the game, we understand everyone's motivations and why they're doing this and what for, and that is the only part of the game that makes me, at least, want to continue playing it. The rest of that game is utter garbage. And I'm not the only one that thinks so. Hint, it is considered wildly by not only myself and the greater Final Fantasy community as a whole, and video game critics and reviewers and whatnot, as the worst Final Fantasy game in terms of the main franchised Final Fantasies. There have been 13 Final Fantasy games that are single player with a number without being like weirdo sequels like 10-2 or 13-2 or 13 Lightning Returns. There have been 13 games. And Final Fantasy 13 is at the very bottom on 13. It's not enjoyed by pretty much everyone. Sorry. I love this sequence. Anyway. That's That's all there really is to 13. It's a hallway of crap with a few diamonds being shoved on through. Alright, so we got about a half an hour to talk about Final Fantasy 15. The latest and probably most ambitious Final Fantasy game to date. It's got a lot of very, very good things going on in that game. And deserves a lot of praise. Like with every Final Fantasy that came before it, it is technologically on the cutting edge of gaming technology, especially for consoles. It is just outstanding. But like with everything great, it does have its own flaws. Number one is that there's just not enough story. And I know why there's not enough story. And there's a very specific reason for that. That is that during the game development, they were taking so long on the game that someone from the production side came down and essentially told the executive producer of that project, hey, finish it. Get it out the door. You have X amount of time to do this. So, they did what they had to do to make that happen. The first thing is they had to take 3 very large sections of the game that they were working on at the time, but were not ready yet, not anywhere near ready, and had to pull those sections from the game. We would know those sections later on as the DLC for Final Fantasy 15. Those were originally supposed to be in the game, but they had to cut them because they weren't ready when they needed to be ready. When they were told your game ships in 6 months, someone looked at the production schedule and said, these are not far enough along. We need to cut them in order to ship the game on time. And unfortunately, that actually happens fairly frequently in the video game community. Having someone come down and tell you that you need to ship it now, that's not unheard of. In fact, it's pretty common. Usually, it's not such large sections of the game that get cut, but it is what it is. Some of the other things that I disliked about the game. Cindy's fan service. So she's wearing a thong that is clearly visible. She's wearing short shorts. She's wearing a tiny little zip-up jacket vest thing with her bra showing. Now, I am not opposed to sex appeal or anything like that. If it's amazing advertising, it can work well in the right situations. And, you know, if she showed up a couple times and kind of showed off for the guys, you know, trying to essentially flaunt it, that's one thing. Because that's her, like, actively trying to do something. But just the fact that she is that, like, that's all she is. Now she becomes, you know, our mechanics, or our mechanic, and we're supposed to, like, follow through with that portion of the storyline, and, you know, it's all amazing and whatnot. Like, that's secondary. The first time we see her It is 100% about fan service. And every time we fuel up our car or get it cleaned or worked on, she shows up, she's leaning all over the hood of the car, she's cleaning the windows. It's clearly fan service. No question about it. Which is a shame, because she actually has a lot of very nuanced character development, and she wants to like help us out and do the right thing, and she wants to be just like her papa, Sid. And like there's a lot to Cindy that we don't get to see, because all we get to see is the fan service. That's all we're allowed to see from her. Another thing that doesn't really help the game is our villain's motivation. We know very early on that this guy is up to something. The Chancellor. We don't really understand what until very near the end of the game. And even then, it's not great. I mean, let's be honest, it's not really all that great. But his motivation is just really lacking. And I don't... It wouldn't have taken much to make his motivations more believable, and no, that's really all it comes down to, is there's just a lot about him that is not great. He's not an effective villain. I mean, he's effective, but he's not motivationally scary. He doesn't... I never once thought that we didn't stand a chance against him. So he didn't really feel like a threat. He wasn't effective to me as a villain. He was effective to the world as a villain, because he did a lot of crazy stuff over that decade-long period, but he just didn't really come off as a very good villain. He's just not good. And actually, the entire final section, from the moment we get sucked into the crystal and have the 10-year jump forward, I was just generally disappointed with the game. And I have a feeling this goes back more to the they had to shoot the game out the door as quickly as possible scenario. Because up to that point, the game was just so good. I loved every moment of that. Even the fishing. I didn't like the fishing. And it was not... because it wasn't like tedious or exceptionally boring, and we didn't have to spend hours doing the fishing. It didn't grate on me, but that final section was not good. That's the main thing. It just the ending wasn't good because everything else that came before it was so good. And so what otherwise was a spectacle section of the game, the ending was purely spectacle. So I can put myself on my own head. Kind of, but not really. I'm sorry. Because there was so much good going on in that game up to that point, that lackluster ending that was kind of forced and I don't know how to put it. It didn't resonate. It was just extraordinarily disappointing. Also, the fact that the only summon we got to actively use being Rama, I don't know. I don't think that was good enough. I think that game deserved more. I think it could have done more. I mean, clearly it could have. They've done a lot with Final Fantasy 15 because of how well received it was, but the characters are great, they're nuanced, they're well designed. The love story between Noctis and Lady Lunafreya is believable and touching. The bromance between the four guys is top-notch design work. I mean, you would be hard-pressed to find a better written game out there than Final Fantasy 15. All the way up to the part where we get sucked into the crystal. Even Ignis's eyes getting damaged, us losing Prompto. It's all works so well. Right up until we get sucked into that freaking crystal. It's beautiful. It's large, open world. The car driving kind of sucks, but the car driving wasn't supposed to be a major mechanic of the game anyway. I don't know, it deserved better than what it was forced to be. It's so good. Okay, so with that out of the way, that is the Final Fantasy franchise. That's all of it. But we got one last thing to do. It's time to go over the ranking systems between myself and the greater Final Fantasy community / critics / game critics. So my breakdown is Final Fantasy IX is on top. That's my personal favorite Final Fantasy game. And up until that last section of the game, I had Final Fantasy 15 as my number 2. But because of that last section, it dropped a few spots, putting Final Fantasy V as my number 2, and Final Fantasy 12 as my number 3, and then Final Fantasy 15. So it dropped 2 slots in that final section. That's how bad I think that final section is on the rest of the game. You know, if the opening had been bad, but then the rest of the game was amazing, we wouldn't be having this discussion. And the reason is because I would have forgotten about that trashy opening. But no, it was the very end. It's the last thing that we have in that game. Is that final section, that horrible section. And that's how you kill games and game franchises, is by having the endings be bad. My number 5 is Final Fantasy VI. My number 6 is Final Fantasy II. My number 7 is Final Fantasy III. My number 8 is Final Fantasy VII. Number 9 is Final Fantasy I. Number 10 is Final Fantasy IV. And that's primarily because of the number of re-releases it's had. Number 11 is Final Fantasy X. Number 12 is Final Fantasy VIII. Number 13 is Final Fantasy 13. So that's my placement. Now, I didn't look at why these other critics or people put these games where they did, and I'm not going to share with you like the breakdown of how many games got how many votes in what sections, but this is the general consensus of the community/critics. Final Fantasy VI is number 1. It is highly reviewed. It gets placed on number 1 in more slots and more people's collections than any other. It is always in the top 3. It's always in the top 3, except for with me, because I have weird taste. Number 2 is Final Fantasy IX. I'm glad to see that it gets as much love as I think it deserves. Number 3 is Final Fantasy IV. Number 4 is Final Fantasy VII. So that is, aside from the Final Fantasy IV being in the number 3 slot, that 7 is probably the biggest discrepancy between me and the greater Final Fantasy community. Number 5 is Final Fantasy XII. Number 6 is Final Fantasy 15. So even critics who pretty much tore it apart because of how little direction, primarily what they tore it apart for was because of how little direction there was and how little actual storyline there was. That was primarily why they tore it apart. With Final Fantasy number 1 being at 7, Final Fantasy X being number 8, Final Fantasy 3 being number 9, Final Fantasy 2 being at the 10 slot, Final Fantasy 5 being at 11, Final Fantasy 8 being at 12, and Final Fantasy 13 at 13. So those last two are the only spots where me and the greater Final Fantasy community agree on actual game placement, on where these games deserve to be. And I can see where most of the critics and whatnot mostly place these games here and why they place them here, but clearly I have different priorities. My priorities are on storyline, whereas most of them are doing mechanics. And if I was just going based on mechanics, I'd say they're mostly right. I would probably have 7 and 12 be closer to the top if I was doing purely mechanical representation. But yeah, Final Fantasy 13 and 8 both being at the bottom of my list and the greater community's list is. I'm glad to agree that I'm glad to see that even if we can't agree on what games are the best, we can agree on which games are the shittiest. So, that is it for Final Fantasy. There's no more Final Fantasy for us to play. So, tomorrow on Community Play, I'm going to be loading up Warframe again. So if you guys want to join me, please do. Also, we have a Discord channel, which I believe you've been seeing the links drop in every once in a while. So if you have a Discord account, please join our Discord channel. This is an open invite to anybody who follows or subscribes or just kind of hangs out on the channel every once in a while. Please go ahead and join us on Discord. There's a lot of Gamescom's channels that I have opened up. I can always add more if people want more. And then I have a few just chat boards, general chat board of discussion, suggestions, Q&A, Magic the Gathering, and role-playing are the chat boards that I have open right now. More can be added or taken away or changes made, depending on our needs, but I kind of want to see our community grow a little bit more. So I've created this as a spot for us to congregate and discuss things and whatnot. On Wednesday, we will be starting our next a look back, which is going to be starting the Elder Scrolls series. I even went and found copies of Elder Scrolls Arena and Daggerfall for us to start with, so look forward to that. On Thursday, we will be doing more game design on Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, transforming Alquadine 2nd edition to that. We'll be doing some more copying and pasting of general world and geography stuff, and then we'll probably start editing that before we do our layout in Photoshop. And I think that's probably about as far as we'll get for Thursday. If we begin to get a little bit farther than that, it'll be working on the religions and what it means to be religious in Alquadine, and which is a lot to get into. And that'll probably take us a couple days of going over and figuring out like what these gods different, like what would be considered their domains, what are the spells that these gods impart upon their different classes, what weapons these gods prefer, what their enemies are. Because I don't remember if all that stuff is in the Alquadine book, so we're going to be doing some pretty in-depth research on the gods in the very near future. And then on Friday, we will be doing more of our look back at the Elder Scrolls. So we'll see how long it takes us to get through Arena and Daggerfall and get into Morrowind and then Oblivion and Skyrim. And hopefully by then there will be a Valenwood or here. The ones that I've heard that are most likely are Valenwood and where are the Argonians from? Blackmarsh. Those are the two most common speculative things that I've seen online for Elder Scrolls 6. But that's for the future. I would like to thank everyone for coming in and hanging out. I would especially like to thank Grim Reaper, Taco Gaming, I believe Kassan and Mr. Henry spoke before we had our system crash. Yeah, I believe that was everybody who participated in tonight's chat. I hope you will join me tomorrow for the start of our, or not for the start, for more Warframe. And I hope you will actually join me in the game tomorrow if any of you are so inclined. After tomorrow's Warframe, we'll probably move to a different game for community play for a little while. We're going to cycle through them until we find a game that a lot of people are willing to join in on. And then we'll probably play that for a little while before cycling to something else. Anyway, hope you guys have a wonderful night, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Have a good one.